Well, good morning and welcome to episode 17 of our look at the Psalms. And you find me this morning, in this little makeshift canopy that we put together. A great day to just share with you some more fantastic thoughts from the Psalms. And I want to read this morning from Psalm 17. And again, I think we'll find, as we've been discovering, some great truths, not just about David, but I think about the way he sees life. And that's the important thing when you look at the Psalms. David is kind of just giving out this soulful diary, just relaying thoughts as and when they come to him. And in doing that, of course, he's expressing not just his own heart, but he lands a lot of truths of things that are significantly important for us when we look at how Scripture looks at life and how we do life. So in Psalm 17, these are the words we read together. Hear a just cause, O Lord, attend to my cry. Give ear to my prayer from the lips free of deceit. From your presence let my vindication come. Let your eyes behold the right. You have tried my heart. You have visited me by night. You have tested me, and you will find nothing. I have purpose that my mouth will not transgress. With regard to the works of man, by the word of your lips I have avoided the ways of the violent. My steps have held fast to your paths. My feet have not slipped. I call upon you, for you will answer me, O God. Incline your ear to me. Hear my words. Wondrously show your steadfast love, O Saviour of those who seek refuge from their adversaries at your right hand. Keep me as an apple of your eye. Hide me in the shadow of your wings from the wicked who do me violence, my deadly enemies who surround me. They close their hearts to pity. With their mouths they speak arrogantly. They have now surrounded our steps. They set their eyes to cast us to the ground. He is like a lion eager to tear, as a young lion lurking in ambush. Arise, O Lord, confront him, subdue him. Deliver my soul from the wicked by your sword, from men by your hand, O Lord, from men of the world whose portion is in this life. You fill their womb with treasure. You are satisfied with children, and they leave their abundance to their infants. As for me, I shall behold your face in righteousness. When I awake, I shall be satisfied with your likeness. It's a fabulous psalm that David reflects on. In fact, in the opening 8 verses, his confidence in his prayer is driven by the fact that, one, God is historically consistent in the way he is. And that's a fantastic confidence, isn't it? God doesn't change with the days, with the eras. He doesn't have mood swings. He's not unpredictable. He's not somebody that you think, it's Wednesday, don't talk to him on a Wednesday. It's morning, he's not a morning person. God is consistent. And because of that, you always have that confidence to approach. But the other thing that drives David in this psalm is his own integrity of life. And you'll find that comes through a number of times. Listen to a just cause. In other words, listen to a just man, Lord. I have done everything, David said, I can to live a right life, and therefore, it's not like he's saying, I deserve you to help me out, but he is saying there is no sort of substantial reason why this has come upon me. I have not brought this on myself. And that gives David a degree of confidence as he prays. His appeal is for protection from his enemies, largely based on these two things. One, that your God, you're always consistent, and two, I'm living a good life, a right life, and therefore, he gives him confidence to make this a request of God. The backdrop to this psalm is probably similar to a lot of the psalms we've looked at already. Largely is exile years on the run from King Saul. Because, of course, David had a valid complaint in all those years. He never did anything wrong, really. He would never transgressed against Saul. He was always someone who was loyal to Saul, even when his men encouraged him to take Saul's life when he had numerous opportunities to do so. David kept saying, I can't touch the Lord's anointed. This is not the right thing to do. So David behaved impeccably, really, towards Saul, even though Saul was disgraceful in his behavior. always hunting David down, hounding him like an animal. And there was times when, of course, this is what oozes out of David. For a man who's just, David said, I've done nothing wrong. Why does this keep coming upon me? And his appeal was for God to kind of support that sense of integrity. And so a quick overview of the psalm. In verses 1 and 2, this is David making his appeal on behalf of a God who is just and right and of his own life of integrity. He then talks about in verses 3 and 4, making reference probably in more detail to the fact that he had purposely, consciously lived his life with integrity. And there's great confidence in that. We're going to look at in a moment, when we talk about holiness, when we talk about living right, it is not accidental. It is not par for the course that because you're a Christian, you're now going to live a right and a good life. Not at all. There's some Christians who do some pretty crazy stuff. And it is not a given that because you have now asked Jesus into your life and experienced this radical change of heart and understand what it means to live a righteous life, that you're going to go ahead and live it. In actual fact, some Christians I know, well, let's just say their behavior is more disgraceful than those who don't even know God. So let's not get onto that idea that once you make a commitment to Christ, your life is just going absolutely on the straight and narrow and you yourself are a perfectly righteous person. It doesn't happen. So David has to make a conscious choice to do the right thing. And it's because he's doing that, he has confidence to come before God. It really is a struggle to trust God to work on our behalf if our life is hugely hypocritical. That's what David combats in his words. In verses 5 to 9, he prays that God will sustain him from succumbing to the behaviors and the habits of those around him. If you look at the verses there, he says, my steps have held fast to your paths. David says, I am doing all that I can not to digress into the behavior of those around me, not to adopt their way of thinking and way of doing things. The old, if you can't beat them, join them idea. And I think that's always a temptation for all of us. We look around sometimes and see people perhaps prospering more, getting on better than us, even though they don't know God. And it makes us think it's futile knowing God. I might as well just do what they're doing. And that's a temptation David had often. And so in verse 6, 7, 8, 9, you will get David praying for God's ear, asking for God's care, looking out for God's protection. These things become very prominent in those verses. And then in verses 10 to 14, David kind of just switches a little bit. He begins to move away from describing his character as a person of seeking God and integrity to describing the nature of his enemies, those who were set against him. And if you look at that, he's pretty hard-hitting, David. In verse 10, he says that they speak arrogantly. That sort of proud, arrogant attitude. And again in verse 10, he talks about the fact that they are a law to themselves, that they have cut others off. He uses these words, they close their hearts to pity, which is a real damning statement to make of another, that they have no care for others. And then in the following verse, verse 11, David says this, they set their eyes to cast us to the ground. People who are kind of had animosity towards God and what God stood for and the people of God. And so all these things as David recounting the nature of those outside, and then he's kind of coming to the end in verses 13 to 15 where he then comes back to this idea of wanting God to deliver him and kind of in a just way revenge on those who are constantly aggressively against God. And so in verse 13 he has strong words like this, arise, confront, subdue, deliver, wanting God to just step in and do something powerful. But that still in itself is an interesting thought, because David is not devising punishment, he's not plotting revenge, he's not rallying support. It's not like he's busy gathering prominent and significant sympathizers to his cause. David's not after trying to get his own back or get a kind of self-prominence, if you like. David's heart is for the unswerving justice of God to be acted out. And not particularly in this psalm, but in many other psalms, David is as happy for that justice to reap on his own head if he is out of line, as he is in praying for it to reap on the heads of those who are constantly against him. So there is no bias in this. He is very open-hearted, David, to see God do the right and the just thing. And part of his confidence, of course, is that God always will do the right and the just thing. And so he finishes in the final verse with this: "As for me, I shall behold your face in righteousness. When I awake, I shall be satisfied with your likeness," which is a striking contrast to the enemies, or the they, if you like, that he's just been talking about, because they are ones who have no ultimate place of bliss, if you like. They're not looking forward to that particular day when all things will be right, when all wrongs will be put right, and peace and happiness and contentment. Their outlook is very much the tangible here and now. It's in the immediate. In fact, David says in verse 14, their portion is in this life. They are happy with their children, they are happy with their family. This is what David unpacks in those closing verses, because all the significance that they come to own, all the power that they seek to wield, or the fame they seek to acquire, is all here and now. It is present, or it's nothing at all. And you meet people like that, who their whole of their life is wrapped into the right here and now. These relatively few years we get on this planet is where all their hope lies, and their belief basically is that when they die, and they just go to sleep. That is not David's perception of life. And so over and above the difficulties he has in the here and now, in the present, he has this overriding confidence that this is just a part, the first couple of chapters of a huge book, because ultimately, he says, good things are coming. And I think that's the great confidence, not an arrogant confidence of Christians. You'll see one day I'm going to get it really good and you won't. That's really, really bizarre way of looking at life. David is drawing his own confidence. He's saying that despite the fact that he might lose on a number of levels here and now, ultimately God will do the right thing for him. So what do we learn from this psalm? Well, there's a couple of things that you find. First of all, in verses 1 to 9, and then secondly, in a moment, we'll look at verses 10 and onwards. In these opening 9 verses, David's appeal is reinforced by the understanding of his own integrity. He is bold in his request. He is bold in categorizing the wicked, because his life is the mirror opposite of theirs. Unlike them, David is seeking to live uprightly. He's seeking to marry his behavior with his most fundamental beliefs. And to me, that is the greatest challenge each of us face. That real appreciation that what I say, what I believe, oozes through the way I live my life. That people won't have to ask whether I have a belief, because they will see it in the things that I do and the way that I live. And to be honest with me, that's a massive challenge, and I'm sure that it's a challenge for you. I don't think any of us ever feel that we quite get it right, and probably would not have the same kind of confidence as David to kind of present our integrity to God as a reason why perhaps God should act on our behalf, because some of us feel like, heck, if I had to do that, I wouldn't have much integrity to present. But David is confident, and we appreciate from these verses this: David's obedience is not to keep God sweet. It's not to reap certain benefits. He's not motivated by this sense of, well, if I behave myself and I act good, God will do more for me. And believe it or not, there are sometimes that Christian thinking that goes along those lines, that the more I behave myself, the more I can expect from God, which is kind of missing the point, don't you think? I think David, part of his journey of holiness and godliness and obedience, is the appreciation that these actions that we do have creative power. What do I mean by that? I mean that with every momentary yielding of your life, your heart, your mind, your spirit, you are being refashioned slowly. You are being reshaped. Every time we obey God, it's like we release an element of power that transforms us to be more like God. The big goal, if you like, is that there is something finer, something stronger, something more human is being developed as we obey. And so incrementally we creep towards Christ likeness, and I'd put a capital C on creep, because nobody leaps forward into being like Jesus. We kind of all experience the 2 steps forward, 3 steps back scenario whenever we try and follow God. But incrementally, the one minuscule act upon another, we become more like Christ. It's the appreciation that this is a journey of a long proportions. It is not a sprint, it's not a quick dash, it's a heck of a long marathon to drawing our lives into line with Jesus. And David knows himself on this journey. And he also knows that God is predisposed to faltering, fumbling people. That God is always there for those who at times can just lose their way. So why do we keep going? Why do we keep pressing on? Why does David keep going in trusting God, even when his rewards look slim and the benefits are, well, virtually invisible at times, or the payoff, if you like, seems non-existent? All reasons why a person who doesn't know God would say, what is the point of doing this if you're getting nothing from it? David's answer is that by doing so, he is transforming, he's being transformed. Slowly, something is happening in the process of this journey, and he's aware of that. So he can speak with great confidence, because he knows that as he keeps walking with God, he's becoming a different David. Sometimes imperceptibly, but it's happening. But the other thing you learn in verses 10 to 15 is almost like the reversal of this, really. David describes those whose behavior and mentality is least reflective of not just what it means to be godlike, but actually what it means to be human. When we talk about arrogance and we talk about having no pity for others, that's not saying, oh, you're not like Jesus. That's saying you're actually not even human. Part of the way we deteriorate is not deteriorating away from being a Christian. We deteriorate from just being human beings that God creates us. And so David is experiencing, as he begins to unpack this, if incremental acts of obedience produce a slow wholeness in our lives, in the same way, the reverse of that can also happen. The more we live according to our rules, our wants, our desires, the more we incrementally become not just less and less like Jesus, but less and less as human beings, if you like. Because just like obedience holds creative power to transform us to be more human, more like Jesus, well, disobedience and disregard of God also holds creative power, every bit as much as obedience. One makes us more human, the other, of course, well, this is interesting because C.S. Lewis was one of the first who coined this phrase of being subhuman. It's a phrase that when you read some of Tom Wright's work, he also picks up on, that the more we stray from God, the more we live life in our own way, according to our own terms, the less human we become, the less reflective of the glory of God, to the point that as we live that life constantly, the less and less we know ourselves. And if you'll take it, I think one of the horrifying pictures that C.S. Lewis builds is that of hell being a place, first of all, where everybody there will be there because they want to be, because they didn't want God, they didn't want that in their life. But also it'll be a place occupied by subhumans who over the period of their life have decayed and corroded that image of God that was upon them, because we're all created in the image of God. But as we live our lives over many, many years, that image is either enhanced or it's slowly deteriorated. And this picture that David talks about, those who are against him, the ungodly, if you like, is a picture of those who more and more and more become deteriorated and separated from that image. So David is talking about those who really their whole of their hope is in this life only. And I think those who ignore God, those who dismiss him as something that's a fable or a freak or not worthy of their time, are people who find themselves having nowhere else to put hope other than this life. what else are you going to hope in unless you have some really strange, off-the-wall kind of idea of what life and afterlife is? But those who reject God and reject the spiritual world inevitably then have to have a bigger, tighter hold on the material world. And so here's David saying they're not expecting anything. Their lot is in this life. They have nothing beyond this world to look at. And in contrast to that, he's saying that the person who is, well, securely wrapped in the understanding of God are people who their satisfaction is rooted in being this spiritual reality of being godlike. That is where their hope is. It is satisfaction, but satisfaction only at a soulful level. See what David says in verse 15? As for me, I shall behold your face. When I awake, I shall be satisfied in your light. Now he's talking future tense, I shall be. He's not necessarily I am, he's saying I shall be. So David is, when he's in his worst moments, what does he do? He looks forward. He looks forward and appreciates the fact that one day things will be different. That ultimately the best has not happened yet. It's still to come. That is the massive hope that we hold as those who love God. We have this understanding that ultimately we will have something that is far richer and deeper than we could ever imagine in this life. So here's what David is saying in this psalm. Slowly but surely, incrementally, we're transformed to become more like God, and we are confident of that integrity. But equally so, on the darker side, there are those who slowly but surely, incrementally, are becoming less and less reflective of God, and in doing so, less and less human. They're becoming subhuman. And that is the great danger, of course, of the way we live life and the way we ignore God. There are consequences to embracing God, but there are also consequences to dismissing him. And that's not this hellfire and brimstone stuff. I want to move away from that. This is just talking about the simple dynamics of being a human being. God has put things in our lives that only respond to him. And as they do that, it creates within us a larger, greater, grittier humanity. But when we dispense of those things, when we ignore those things, when we say those things don't count, what do we become then? Without the guiding hand of divinity over us, who else takes the wheel? Who else steers that ship? Well, of course, once you dismiss God, you're then open to the influences of not just many things, but many inferior things, because we all believe something. And our heart is the heart that should be and could be responding more to God. So as you take this psalm, have a think about what we've said, have a think about what David is writing about. And as you do that, let God again begin to speak to you and challenge you about the great value of living a life that is holy and right before him. God bless you.